Hello, can you hear me? Cool, all right. I'm Andy Gale. I'm here to talk about CakePHP at a massive scale on a budget, obviously dependent on the scale you think. But yeah, I'm a web developer. I've been playing with websites since '96, and I'm from Bristol in the UK. I may not look like I've been playing with websites since I was 96, but I am actually older than I look, so there we are. Bristol, Clifton Suspension Bridge, that's pretty much all I can say about Bristol. We've got a lovely little bridge, doesn't it look nice? Yeah. So anyway, I work for Future Publishing. We're based in Bath in the United Kingdom, and we have offices in London, San Francisco, New York, and Sydney. We publish over 180 special interest publications. Now, I always think special interest sounds a bit like pornography, but it's not. It's publications which people are really passionate about. It could be games, it could be science fiction, that kind of thing. And our staff, our editorial teams, they're very much interested in what you're interested in if you buy the magazines. If you buy SFX, that's our science fiction magazine. The guys that write that, they're really, really interested in science fiction. I mean, I've been to their office. They've got Daleks, they've got Cyberman, they've got Starship Enterprise models all over the place. It's ridiculous. But as well as that, we've got cycling publications, the cycling teams, they all cycle to work. And we've got knitting, Simply Knitting, actually the biggest selling magazine in the UK. That's quite a frightening office as well. There's loads of people that look a lot like my mum who spend all day knitting. It's a sight to behold, and I've only been there once, and I left very quickly. We've also got a lot of the official games titles, so official PlayStation, official Xbox in the UK and in the US and in Australia as well. We've also got .NET. I know any of the guys here who are from the UK would have heard of .NET. It's actually about making websites. I actually bought the first issue of .NET, which is essentially what got me into the internet. So I'll always have Future Publishing to thank for that. We've also got the World of Warcraft magazine, which if you're into Warcraft, I'm sure it's very nice. I don't know. I've never looked at it, but I'm sure it's amazing. But I'm here today to talk about the websites, obviously. We've got a brand called the Radar brand. We make Tech Radar, which is about technology, Bike Radar, which is about bikes. I won't go through the rest of them. I'm sure you can work them out for yourselves. But the two sites which we've made using CakePHP, CyclingNews and Total Film, I'm going to talk to you about today. So our websites, they contain news features, reviews, products, and there's a forum. They're not big applications, but they are ad funded. The people who use the sites are very passionate about using the sites. We've got some very militant people in our forums that spend all day posting nonsense, and it really is nonsense. But they seem very passionate about a subject, so that's great. They come to our website. As you can see, it says they're ad funded. When they come to our website, they click on ads or view the ads. We make money. Everyone's happy. So that's great. Coming from the UK, it's actually quite interesting because I've been using the BBC website over here, and you've got adverts. It's ridiculous. In the UK, we don't have any adverts on the BBC website. We pay our license fee. You don't get any adverts. And that's a great competitor for us because obviously people can go to the BBC website in the UK and read the cycling news, and there's no adverts. So we've got this big bar of adverts, and that's a problem for us. But hopefully our content shines through. We've got our passionate editorial teams which really focus on the subject. So our platforms that we use WordPress. I know, WordPress, everyone hates WordPress, but it's got its place. Our corporate website is written in WordPress. futureplc.com. We also use Drupal. Photoradar.com is written in Drupal. I've heard some quite interesting Drupal talks here. Be interesting to try and integrate Photoradar with CakePHP using some of the things I've learned here. this weekend. But for the larger builds, we use CakePHP, Total Film Cycling News. So the first site we built in CakePHP is totalfilm.com. As you can see there, I put it in this slide after seeing everyone failed to connect to the internet earlier. So that's worked out quite well. Totalfilm.com was our first CakePHP build. It had about 6 developers, PHP developers working on it. And we had 2 front-end developers, the CSS, HTML, the JavaScript. We had a design change halfway through, which is not great. But the site was completed with time to spare, which for a future publishing website build was at the time unheard of, to be honest with you. We've never launched a site on time until Total Film, which was on time, which was brilliant. So the lessons we learned when we were making Total Film with CakePHP is that a lot of the developers, myself included, thought we knew better. We were trying to avoid the conventions, write our own classes, everything like that. And we didn't know better. We should have just used the Cake core stuff. And we didn't know better. And that's something we really learned because we had 4 different ways of doing everything. And we only needed the one, which was the one CakePHP provided. So the thing we took away from it is that we really should use developers that get the framework. I don't know, you guys here understand the framework, use the framework, appreciate, but a lot of the developers you get in that claim to know CakePHP don't really know quite CakePHP. So when we launched Total Film, we had expected 30,000 page views, and we got 100,000, which is obviously brilliant. The site held up really well. It was really happy, and so we all went to the pub, which is in the UK, that's what we do. Go to the pub. So we went to the pub, we all got very drunk, and we came in the next day with a bit of a hangover, which was a bit of a problem. Oops, hang on, there we go. There, right. Yeah, the day after, the marketing department, in their wisdom, decided they were going to start pimping out links. Brilliant. So we got IMDb, took up one of our really popular stories, and we got 500,000 page views in about an hour. Or we didn't, because the site unfortunately fell over. CakePHP view caching just couldn't handle it, and that's because the server couldn't run enough copies of PHP. It's that simple. We didn't plan for it, we didn't expect to get that many page views, and the site fell over. So we had to fix it with a hangover. So what did we do? Well, we thought, well, we don't need all these dynamic aspects of the site. We don't need to generate the username and the logon. We can do that with JavaScript. We can store a cookie. And we cached full pages in memcache. We used the helper. When the page was generated, it pushed it in memcache. And you can do a really clever thing if you use Nginx, which is essentially you use memcache, and Nginx can just serve the page directly from memcache, which works really well, and it's really quick. And I'd recommend you look into it. I've got a little link there, very small, but a little how-to on my website there. But our quick fix cache solution wasn't really that perfect. We had hub pages, which is essentially homepage features pages, listing pages essentially. They weren't immediately updated because they were just cached for a small amount of time, which meant simple changes with entire pages being cached. They took a long way to propagate through the rest of the site. For example, if you change the title of an article in a news article, you have to update the homepage listing, the news listing, the news archive listing, stuff like that. And the site was also susceptible to the thundering herd problem, which we've actually at Future stolen from a quite complicated Linux problem with sockets. But essentially, thundering herd, there's a thundering herd, thundering away. And what it is, essentially, is you don't often come across it until you really come across it. And when the cache expires, someone rebuilds the cache, we call that the unlucky user. The unlucky user, at smaller scales, it doesn't really matter because they come along, they rebuild the cache for you, and you can continue. But when you're getting 1,000 page views a second, you're getting quite a few unlucky users at the same time. So this page takes half a second to generate. That's maybe 500 requests you need to deal with, which are all trying to repopulate the cache at the same time. So you've got a lot of unlucky users, and as I've put there, you've got a very unlucky server because it crashes, as I noted earlier. So what can you do to solve that? Well, you can use soft expire, which just essentially your single unlucky user rebuilds the cache item, and you just create a little lock in the cache, which just stops other people trying to recreate. Because the item is only soft expired, you can serve the slightly out-of-date content to everybody else. And when the lock obviously must expire in case the rebuild fails, but that solves that problem. But the best way to solve the thundering herd problem is really to just update the cache when things change. A lot of people look at cache as not persistent and transient, and it doesn't need to be like that. If you keep your cache timeouts very high and you promise to always update the cache, then you don't need to worry about the thundering herd problem. You can use what we have identified as positive cache expiry, where you just push new things into the cache and you just update it when it changes. It's sometimes easier said than done. It can get quite complicated, which is something we needed to solve when we started working on CyclingNews.com. There's a lovely picture of a man cycling on a bike. There's a lot of them on CyclingNews.com. Alberti Contador going up a hill. There's a lot of that going on the site. So CyclingNews.com was our next project. Again, we decided to do it on CakePHP. But CyclingNews.com had been recently acquired by Future Publishing. It was, and remains the world's #1 cycling site. If you like pro cycling, then you'll know about CyclingNews.com, I'd hope anyway. But the site was actually just flat HTML. The editors would hand code the HTML and FTP it up. It sounds ridiculous, but we had our requirement for editorial staff were people that knew an awful lot about pro cycling, which, there's not that many, but they also needed to know how to hand code HTML and FTP it to a server and fix it if they got it wrong, because if they get it wrong when the Tour de France is on, that's quite bad. But the one key thing about flat HTML is it's obviously very fast to serve. You can't really serve content any faster than flat HTML. So our next project, CyclingNews.com, we needed a CMS, obviously. After using CakePHP for Total Film, we were very keen to use CakePHP. We need to de-skill the editorial requirements. Editors shouldn't need to be able to type in HTML. We needed a more modern design, which I think we achieved, but we'll see. And we still needed to handle the 4 million page views a day during the Tour de France. The page views came very much in a spike as well. Because what happens essentially is if you watch pro cycling on the TV, it will look like there's a lot of people just cycling along, and that's essentially what's happening for, I think it's about 3 hours. They just dawdle along on their bikes. They don't really achieve anything. Nothing really happens. Someone might fall off, and that's hilarious. But really, it's a bit dull. And I was amazed to have to admit this, because sitting in an office full of people that like cycling, when the Tour de France is on, they get really excited, and you're sat at your desk tapping away going, oh God, that's boring. And they're getting really excited. So I actually went over last year when the Tour de France was on, and I thought, why are they getting so excited? And towards the end of the stage, if you're going to get excited by cycling, you're going to get excited in the last hour, because there's a sprint, there's a massive climb up a mountain on a bike, which is amazing the speeds they go up at, and they accelerate away from each other. And I'm not a great fan of cycling, but it's really quite compelling, and that is why we get this massive peak, which you can see you can see that actually. There's a big bar there at 16, which is 4 o'clock, British Standard Time, which is essentially when the Tour de France ends, and that's when the big peak is. So it's a news site, CyclingNews.com, so we couldn't have the problems we had with Total Film. We needed the content to update instantly. We had very high peaks during the Tour de France, or we had very high peaks when there was a doping story, and these doping stories come along, we get an email, we put them live. We've got notification we're going to put the story live, but Cycling News is the world's leading cycling website, and if we have a doping story, we need to break it first. So we just couldn't tolerate things not updating straight away. And the other issue we had is we don't have Facebook's hardware budget. I mean, obviously, Josh talked earlier about the cloud, and that's a solution to this problem. But in many ways, if you can predict it, then that's great. But if it's a doping story, you get an email at 3, you need to put the story live at 3:05, it's quite hard to scale up that quickly. So how would we scale to use caching to get all of these pages served? Well, what we needed to do is, instead of caching the whole pages, which is not the most scientific approach, we decided to cache individual elements of the page. We called them panels. In CakePHP talk, it's an element, really. But what we did is we made those individual panels relate to a certain model. A news listing, for example, a features listing, or the carousel, which we have on a lot of our sites. And then when that panel, we know that we may need to update that panel when something to do with that model changes. That makes the problem slightly easier to solve. So again, saw everyone struggling connecting to the internet, so I put it on a slide. The race and results panel, you may be able to make it on the left-hand side. That's a panel. The big, horrible flash object, that's a panel. And it's quite controversial, the flash object. We get a lot of stick about that. The news panel, the tech panel, even all these lovely little adverts you see, they're all panels, and some of them are easy to solve, fixing them and getting the cache cleared. But essentially, if a news story changes, then you're probably going to need to update the model news, which is associated with the news panel, and that's how we worked out how to clear the cache and update. So Cycling News, the target we were set when we decided to make the site, we needed to be able to handle 1,000 requests per second, and that's not HTML, that's not JavaScript and CSS and everything else. That's HTML being served every second. That's a lot of HTML, and it's quite hard to do. But we set about to do it, because otherwise we wouldn't be here. So we really wanted to use CakePHP, but we were really worried about the problems we ran into when we were using Total Film. Would it scale to 1,000 requests per second? So we had to do some benchmarks. Bearing in mind these benchmarks were done with an early version of 1.2 a couple of years ago, and it's very much improved. But we tried to use CakePHP request action, and we found that was ridiculously slow. It seemed like a really good solution, but it obviously wasn't. I mean, a lot of you people probably know that. So we thought, well, what we could do is we could use individual elements cached, cache the model, cache the elements using the element cache. But that was actually very quick, but it was just too slow for us. So what we instead did is we used CakePHP for the CMS, and just to try and explain to you how complicated it is, you have all these different types of races. You have the Tour de France, which is a race which has got, I think it's 21 stages. It's got so many different results. There's points for going up the mountain quicker. There's a sprint finish, you get points for that. You get a general classification. You get all these other various scores you can have to do with pro cycling. And as well as that, it's not just the Tour de France. You have mountain bike races, which are a completely different format again, or track races, which they have heats and all these different types of races. So it's very hard to get the CMS to actually work for that. The CMS development was around 5 months of quite a few, I think it's 3 or 4 people's time maybe, just working full time on the CMS just to get all the different features. We had, when people finish races, they get a PDF sent to them, editorial team, and we wrote results parser, which read the PDF and split out the riders and the times and put that onto the site. And there was an awful lot of work that went into that, and CakePHP was brilliant for that. It really helped us do that quickly. But what we also did is we used CakePHP for HTML in the panels, the individual elements that I showed you earlier. And what we did is we got CakePHP to publish those HTML panels into Memcache. And then we just wrote a very simple PHP script which compiled the HTML panels into pages. Used the URL, it worked out which panels went into which parts of the page, and fetched them from Memcache and then compiled the page into a bit of HTML which we then served out. So what that resulted in is using CakePHP with the cached elements, our average was 0.15 seconds. Doesn't seem like that slow, does it? But when you're doing 1,000 requests a second, it's a bit too slow. The page compiler, just as was, 0.04 seconds. But the page compiler with a little bit of optimization, we got it down to 0.0031 seconds. The optimization was essentially, we had a couple of classes and a configuration file which stored which panels went where. And we just basically read that in once, serialized it, and chucked it out to a file. And that, as you can see, that sped up the site by quite a factor. So, but how do we update the panels once we're in Memcache? Well, we identified we basically had two different types of panels. We had a view panel, which was an article, a news story, a feature, a report from the race, a live report. And basically, when that article changes, any panels associated with that article need to be updated. Your news story, related articles to that news story, anything like that, quite simple, a problem to solve, you can just update. But the more complicated panel was the hub panel, which is, as I put there, just a listing. It's difficult to work out the latest news story, or it could be the most commented news stories, or the most viewed news stories. You can't update all of these panels every time something changes. So what did we do? Well, we came up with a solution where, for the hub panels, we just stored the find parameters for each panel. And we just checked before save and after save, compared the result in arrays, and if they changed, the HTML panel just needs to be regenerated. And I've drawn you a little diagram which basically indicates what I've just said. But the before save, if it's changed, we check in the after save, taking great care to make sure the query isn't cached. And if it has changed, we update the HTML panel. But we had lots of panels, so we needed to avoid making the CMS really slow, generating every news panel every time when the editorial team edited a news story. There are lots of editorial team. There's about 12 of them, I believe. They're all going to be writing news. We can't have all of that stuff updating every time. So we wrote a CakePHP shell, which just works through each of the panels and publishes them. I called that the panel worker, an original name I know. And it's just a CakePHP shell. It just works through the panels. I obviously duplicated a bit of copy and paste there. And, but the key part of it is it uses a queue system to prevent panels being regenerated over and over again. The Tour de France, we actually worked out that had something in the region of 190 panels every time you edited something. We couldn't have that happen. Tour de France being edited by multiple editors. The CMS would be always working through it. So the panel worker used a bit of very, harping back to my C days when I first started doing professional programming, we used the parent-child architecture with a bit of inter-process communication, which you'd be amazed, but you can actually do this with PHP, and it's been running for about a year and it hasn't crashed, and it works quite well. We use a state engine, which is essentially, you have a collection of file descriptors, sockets which are open, and they're marked which one needs to be read, which one needs to be written, and you basically go, oh, I need to read from this one, I need to write from that one, which allows you to deal with multiple connections fetching multiple panels from the CMS and then putting them into memcache again, which is, once we'd written that, we were amazed that actually PHP was able to do it, but it was able to do it really well. And it worked and it meant that our team of PHP developers could actually maintain it. Then if we'd written it in C, then it would only be me that could have maintained it. So the panel worker, it gets the next item from the panel queue, which is down there on the left, fetches the panel in HTML from the CMS, and then just publishes to the HTML to memcache server. Our two web servers, www1 and www2, we've only actually got two web servers serving all of these 1,000 requests a second, which is quite an achievement, I think. But we also generated the pages for 60 seconds, put them into memcache, and served them directly from Nginx, like we did with Total Film, which gives us even more headroom. So when the next open story comes along, there's absolutely no problem there. The www servers also run panel workers, just in case any panels fall out of memcache. But we also store the panels on the disk, so worst case scenario, we can have a very old copy of the panel being served to the user. That's better than nothing, essentially. So we launched CyclingNewscom, and we've got a really big thread, actually. If you ever fancy a laugh, or just like seeing how militant forum users can be, we've got 1,181 forum posts complaining. I actually had to update that because someone posted another one a couple of nights ago. It did say 1180. We've now got 1181. They were very, very unhappy that we'd taken away their 10-year-old design site, which was just very basic HTML, and we'd made it into a new website. I actually got a tweet from Lance Armstrong as well, saying how much he hated the site, which we were amazed at. And it was like, whoa, not everyone gets Lance Armstrong saying the website they worked on. It's crap. But it's not quite that, because Lance Armstrong's always hated Cycling News, so it's not a problem. But don't worry, Lance, I've got my Live Strong band on. I'm not bitter. I'm happy to support your charity. But the best thing is we easily handle the traffic. And we had loads of headroom, and we continue to have headroom. And the editorial team, they had a record day. I think they had 5 million page views in a day, and they said, "Oh, we've done really well." And I said, "Go away, get me 10 million. We can handle that." It's really nice to be in that position where you know that the site is going to stay up and handle that much traffic. The downside to the solution we presented and we made is the site isn't that interactive. We don't have users, we don't have comments. I mean, from the 1,181 forum comments we had when we relaunched the site, we weren't that keen with putting user comments on the site. But one of the major problems we have is a lot of pro cycling is doping stories, and if we have people being able to comment, people will comment calling everyone cheats, and that won't be very good because we'll get sued. So you could use a similar system to what we've done to just update caching when things change. We've got a couple of examples later on. It's not just me rambling on, don't worry. And you could use a queue system similar to the panel worker to update your content as things change. The queuing system is very useful because it just takes some of the load away from as you update stuff. I mean, that depends on whether you need things to update instantly or not. But one of the major changes we'd make is instead of storing the find parameters, we'd use a model method. I've heard a lot about fat models, and I think that's exactly right. We'd use a model method for each panel, which would save us. We wouldn't need to find parameters in our config file and in the code, which would work a lot better. And despite being very fast, the site does lack interactivity, which, I mean, a lot of you are web application developers, that's a problem for you, but for a new site, that's fine. And we'd also use Membase, which is being used by Zynga, which make Farmville. And it just basically replaces Memcache and the file store for the panels. And mem-based, you can use that with your CakePHP applications now, because it uses memcache protocol anyway, so you can just use it and you get a data store as well. It's got all kinds of clever features where it keeps popular cached items in memory. You can then configure it to keep slightly less popular stuff on a SSD, and you can then keep even less popular stuff on disk. So I'd recommend you have a look at that. But since we did all of these benchmarks, as I say, that was over a year ago, and Cake 1.3 has got a lot quicker, which I'm pleased to say. I saw recently the lazy model stuff by Frank de Graaf, and I know other people contributed to that as well. That certainly makes CakePHP a lot quicker. But the one thing we have noticed is even if everything's cached, CakePHP is still connecting to MySQL, and there's nothing to be connected, which I'm sure you're aware of that, but it's just, obviously, it's a bit of unnecessary connection, which we don't need, and a bit of unnecessary load on the database as well. But yeah, so we're actually going to build a new site, and we're going to implement the following caching system as an improvement, kind of after all the stuff we've learned making Cycling News. I'd like to just go through this and show you what we're going to do. I don't know exactly if, well, there we go. Okay, so essentially, yeah, so what we were thinking, we've looked into it slightly, and with our CMS, which for Cycling News is very, very complicated, it's got all these different features, we were thinking, well, we don't, obviously loading and parsing this code is quite slow, and what we learned with the serializing the objects and then just unserializing them and instantiating them that way, which is so much quicker. Maybe we should just have a simpler version of the models and everything, a separate application essentially for the front-end website. I would like to get your comments on that later on. But that's what we're thinking. We have the load model. I'm told that's the quickest way to do it. And each panel, we get the data for each panel using the article method. We have our very simple couple of elements, which we use an article list element, and then we just echo it out this way. Just a very simple element, echoing out just a list of LIs, nothing that fancy. And we have our getLatest method here, which just talks to the cache. If the data exists, it returns it. If not, it fetches it, finds it, writes it in the cache, returns it. So, as I said, the problem is obviously updating stuff as things change. So we've used this cache method system where we just have an array. That's the method we want to call. And the article type ID, there's different news stories, features, reviews, they have different article type IDs. So when things are saved, we essentially, in the after save, we evaluate it, we write the model for the view essentially out, and then we loop through each method which is in our cache methods array, echo it out, and then call the user function which updates the cache for us. So that's essentially a very similar way to the entire panel worker thing I've gone through, but it allows us to have interactivity, which should be good on our new site build. If I just pull up the So essentially, we've just got a very simple version of the website here, which we've managed to get. Obviously, when it first loads, it's very slow, but caching every single element, we're keeping it down to 0.12 seconds. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear your comments, your questions, obviously, because we've gone through these various systems, quite controversial, I'm sure some of you think. Yeah, so your questions, please. Sure.
With the page worker, is there a reason you didn't use a message queue, like rather than queue, or like how are you storing which jobs are in the queue? Are you putting it into a database and then putting it back out? Or?
Yeah, essentially the queue is essentially just a file system. We needed the queue to be shared between the page compiler in the front end and the CMS, the panel worker, so they could just write stuff in the queue. The page compiler is very, very stupid, deliberately, because it needs to be really quick. So when it works out, it doesn't have a panel, it just writes it into just a directory, essentially. The panel worker master process is always there, fetching all the data out of the panel queue. So essentially, the panel's word should get stored in the kind of order that they are generated in and they're requested in. So they should work through in the same order, and basically it will work and get updated.
So did you look at other queuing systems, like rather than queue or zero and queue type thing?
We did. We evaluated quite a few, but we just tried to keep it really simple for the page compiler because it just needs to be so quick. Any code we're including, which is more complicated than writing a file, slowed it down, and we needed it to be as quick as so we could get those performance figures. Okay. Yep.
How do you deal with data that's being saved in related models, like if you're using save all or something of that sort?
Yeah. Basically, a good example of what you're asking is articles have media associated with them. For that's fine, because when you save an article, it's a view, essentially. The difference I point out, the hub and the view. So the media, you just go through and update each panel associated with the article. So you've got, because we're an advert-funded website, we like page views. So we've got a page for every single gallery item you view. Yeah? So when you update the article, you then update each of the panels associated with the article, which includes the media, the images associated with that panel, if that answers your question.
The panel basically is like a list of dependencies.
Yeah, we've essentially got a configuration file which just defines the panel. It defines which models it's associated with. Some panels are associated with more than one model because of the reason you say. Yeah. So a good example is the races panels have a relationship to articles. You can have a race report, which is an article, but you can also have an image which is associated with a race. So different panels can be associated with different models. Okay? Yeah? We did, yeah. We had a very, very difficult importing from HTML problem, which a colleague of mine solved. Actually, he taught himself Ruby and wrote himself a Ruby script, which imported all of the content, which was difficult. We couldn't import all of the content. We essentially chose major races, news articles, features, going back, I think it's about 10 years, and just imported those. Okay, is that it? Excellent. Well, thanks very much.